Thank you everyone for joining us today for Protecting Our Wildlife Neighbours. My name is Claire Penny, and I am a Community Relations Advisor with the City of Edmonton. Did you know that Edmonton's River Valley is the longest stretch of urban parkland in North America? We have this huge river valley that is 12 times larger than New York Central Park. It offers a beautiful home for a lot of wildlife, including coyotes, beavers, skunks, moose, deer, and lots of other species of birds and many more types of wildlife. Today, we are joined by our partners at WILDNorth, the University of Alberta's Edmonton Urban Coyote Project, and one of our wildlife officers, Gareth Villanueva, to chat about how we can help protect and coexist with our wildlife neighbors, and about Edmonton's new feeding bylaws. Carly Lynch began her journey with WILDNorth in the spring of 2013 as an animal care intern, then was hired on as an education coordinator at the end of that summer. She is now the education manager at WILDNorth. She develops and delivers wildlife education programs, manages WILDNorth's social media, fields calls, and educates through the Wildlife Helpline, and is also a wild care wildlife technician. Carly enjoys spreading appreciation and respect for wildlife, using education to minimize negative human-wildlife interactions, and helps provide compassionate care to wildlife in need. Dr. Colleen St. Clair is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Alberta and has led the Edmonton Urban Coyote Project for the last 12 years. Thank you, Colleen, Carly, and Gareth, for joining us today. We will start off by hearing more about Colleen's research.
Thank you for joining this webinar today and for your interest in wildlife feeding. I'm going to talk for the next 10 minutes about why it's important not to feed coyotes. And I'll share that perspective by offering some of the information we've collected about that topic from the Edmonton Urban Coyote Project. So my message today is a pretty simple one. It is, do not feed coyotes or their prey. And what I'll try to do is explain why I have come to that conclusion and give you the kind of information that would let you come to the same conclusion. So I've reached that conclusion through my work for the past 12 years on the Edmonton Urban Coyote Project. I started this project in collaboration with the City of Edmonton and with support from Animal Damage Control because I noticed that coyotes were more and more abundant and visible in urban areas of Edmonton. I've been assisted over the years with a lot of other people on this project, and I show you and introduce you to a few of them here. It includes my collaborators at the City and Animal Damage Control, plus several graduate students and undergraduate students. We set out 12 years ago to understand the sources of conflict. We were looking for some particular things that others had already identified as correlated with conflict with coyotes. It had to do with how coyotes select habitat and move through urban areas, what they eat, and their body condition, including various metrics of health and disease. These things are known to contribute to conflict, but the specific mechanisms are not so well known. We thought if we understood those, we could suggest mitigation that could reduce the conflict. Well, I'll begin at the end and tell you that what we concluded at the end of these studies is that food, what coyotes eat, and specifically their access to human sources of food, really seems to dictate all the other forms of conflict. And we developed this conceptual model that as coyotes move from a diet that's natural in natural prey like mice and voles in the river valley, in a natural habitat of natural vegetation, such as in the river valley, as they transition to eating more and more anthropogenic or human origin food and living more and more in anthropogenic habitat like residential neighborhoods, they typically become quite unhealthy. And those unhealthy animals get stuck there, like in a feedback loop, being dependent, more and more dependent on that anthropogenic diet and habitat. And this whole transition seems to be mediated by parasites. So let me show you a little bit more about how that might work. But first I want to say that I'm a big proponent of Edmonton's new bylaw to prohibit feeding of wildlife. I think everybody can imagine that, however well-intentioned, that's a bad idea, and intentional feeding should be prohibited. But I think a lot of people would underestimate how many ways we feed coyotes accidentally. Coyotes eat a lot of unexpected things. That's stuff like pet food and garbage, which maybe people recognize already, but also things like compost, whether industrial or backyard varieties. They eat a lot of birdseed, and of course they're attracted to the things that also eat birdseed. They eat a fair few cats that are at large, and some coyotes might learn to specialize on them. Coyotes also enter backyards in search of food of various types, and you might be surprised that one of the types of foods they look for in backyards is fruit on fruit trees, and they'll go to some lengths to get it, even if they can be deterred fairly easily. So I'm going to tell you 6 reasons now that eating food sourced from humans is bad news for coyotes and people. Reason number 1 is that when coyotes eat processed food, they have a higher likelihood of being in conflict. This plot shows you the results of a stable isotope analysis that shows that urban coyotes that were reported as being in conflict had samples from their hair that differed from the hair samples of urban coyotes without conflict. Specifically, they had more of the stable isotope of carbon that reveals they were eating processed food, and less of the stable isotope of nitrogen that reveals they were eating less protein. Second, we know from coyotes and a lot of other carnivores that being food conditioned, associating food with people, makes coyotes more aggressive, more likely to approach people. And that's been associated with 2 high-profile attacks by coyotes on toddlers. It's also been associated with a sudden spike in coyote attacks on people that have occurred in Vancouver and Calgary over the last few months. This kind of habituation to people caused by food conditioning doesn't stop there. It also affects pets. Coyotes that are habituated to people are much more likely to enter residential yards looking for pets, and they have no problem seeing animals through wire fences and jumping over them. A third reason to avoid letting coyotes eat human-sourced food is that it's bad for them. Here's an example using compost. This plot shows that coyotes that are eating compost are being exposed to a compound known as mycotoxins. This is just basically rotting food. These substances are controlled in animal feed by the federal government because they are known to disrupt immune systems and contribute to disease. We measured some compost being eaten by coyotes to show that coyotes eating even tiny amounts, like berry-sized amounts of this compost daily, were being exposed to mycotoxins that exceeded federal limits. And at those same compost sites, coyotes were depositing scats that contain 10 times more eggs of tapeworm parasites than the scats contained at natural sites where coyotes occurred. A 5th reason that we need to be careful to avoid feeding coyotes is that exposure to some kinds of food is associated with parasites of many types, including a new one that has arrived in Alberta fairly recently. Just in the last 10 years, there's a new European strain of a parasite called Echinococcus multilocularis. This is a zoonotic parasite, meaning that it can also infect people. And 17 people have been infected with this parasite in the last few years. Edmonton seems to have an extremely high, well, a very high rate of this parasite, very high rate of prevalence of this parasite in its coyote population. So it's really important to wash your hands if you're doing things like gardening in soil that might contain the eggs of these parasites. I think reason number 4 to avoid feeding coyotes is that it changes their habitat use. This slide refers to mangy coyotes. Coyotes with mange in our studies occupied home ranges that were much larger, 10 times larger than coyotes that did not have mange. Those mangy coyotes also had much more overlap in their home ranges. They were more active during the day. And all of these behaviors are more likely to bring them into conflict with people. In those residential areas, mangy coyotes were more likely to access yards, shown here with the purple dots on an overlay map. They were more likely to access yards that had some kind of anthropogenic food, like compost, and they were more likely to try to den or shelter under decks and houses, bringing those diseases into closer contact with people. The sixth reason to avoid feeding coyotes is that it seems to disrupt their microbiome. This plot shows how the microbiome in the gut of urban coyotes is a little different from the microbiome of coyotes in more rural areas, which tend to be healthier. The urban coyotes tend to have more anthropogenic food in their diet, measured partly with this stable isotope of carbon, but they also have higher spleen masses, which is an indicator of disease presence or progression. It could be that by disrupting the microbiome of coyotes, we make them less and less able to digest a natural diet and more prone to seeking out a human-associated diet. So for all these reasons, we should avoid letting coyotes access human food. We should definitely not feed them intentionally. I think I've shown you how that food is sort of a linchpin to the other problems associated with conflict, having to do with parasites or habitat or pets. If we want to keep our coyotes nice and natural and healthy and conflict-free, we need to make sure they don't access human food. Thanks a bunch for listening, and thanks too to the people that have supported this work with funding and effort over many years.
My name is Gareth with the City of Edmonton Park Rangers on the wildlife team, and I'm here to talk about feeding of wildlife in the city. So this spring, City Council passed an update to multiple bylaws to specifically deal with wildlife feeding activities, behaviors, or conditions. Previous city bylaws did not address complaints arising from inappropriate feeding of wildlife or other behaviors that created or led to nuisance conditions. Fine amounts for these new bylaws range from $250 to $500. The three bylaws that were modified were the Community Standards Bylaw, the Public Places Bylaw, and the Parkland Bylaw. The City of Edmonton, for the purposes of this bylaw, defined wildlife as non-domesticated animals or an animal that is wild by nature and living in its natural habitat, but did not include feral cats or birds. So for a summary of the bylaw amendments, a person shall not feed, attempt to feed, permit the feeding of, or deposit food for consumption by coyotes on land they own or occupy. That was the Community Standards Bylaw amendment. A person shall not feed, attempt to feed, or deposit food on land they own or occupy for consumption by wildlife, feral cats, or birds in a way that leads to a public safety risk, health risk, or nuisance condition. And a person shall not use, place, or allow other wildlife attractants on land they own or occupy in a way that leads to a public safety risk, health risk, or nuisance condition. And we will define a nuisance condition later. What is a nuisance condition? In respect to wildlife, feral cats, or birds, it means any excessive accumulation of accessible edible materials on their property, including but not limited to raw or cooked meat, harvested fruits, harvested vegetables, bird feed, or suet, accumulation of rotten, spoiled, or moldy food left openly accessible or improperly contained, habituation, food conditioning, or increased presence of wildlife to the area generally or to the specific property due to availability of food on the property, or any property damage to neighboring properties or parkland by wildlife due to the availability of food on the property. So this includes, but is not limited to, people that dump giant piles of seed on their own property, which eventually leads to the loss of vegetation in surrounding areas. There was a stormwater pond in North Edmonton where a large amount of seed was being dumped, and it eventually led to an area of about 40 to 50 square feet of the grass being completely eaten up by all the geese. Some examples of attractants and nuisance conditions. So this is actually a pile of meat and dog food, which we found during one of our patrols. And it's any intentionally or unintentionally feeding wildlife can increase coyote habituation and large congregations of birds in urban areas, resulting in wildlife conflicts. Some of you may have seen the story of the guy who ended up attracting thousands of seagulls to a parking lot in Edmonton. So that would definitely meet a nuisance condition. Examples of these attractants include unsecured garbage, fallen fruit, open composting bins, and birdseed. So this is one of the community compost sites that we visited, and I'm 100% in favor of community composting. I think it's a great thing that everyone should be doing. But when it is open like this, it attracts other animals that are there to eat the vegetable scraps, or the animals come to eat the animals that eat those vegetable scraps, as Colleen alluded to earlier. This was just another open community compost bin, and as you can see, this could be very easily remedied by just building up a fence on the third side of, or the fourth side of that, and that would reduce conflict quite quickly. Unsecured garbage. So with the city's new garbage cart program, we are hoping that this is not as much of an issue going forwards, but sometimes people will leave their garbage out several days in advance, and then crows or magpies or coyotes will get into that garbage and spread it everywhere, and that will attract a bunch of other wildlife as well. This is clearly an example of somebody using too much birdseed. While I'm a bird watcher myself and I love the variety of urban birds in Edmonton, that is clearly an excessive amount of birdseed and would meet the nuisance conditions under the new bylaws. This is the article I was alluding to earlier, where a man attracted thousands of seagulls to West Edmonton. And we actually had another one recently where an individual was attracting hundreds of other birds as well to a North Edmonton parking lot. So clearly there are many people that think this is acceptable to do. It's not. The updates to the bylaw will help discourage inappropriate feeding and support our goal of cohabiting with nature and embracing the natural beauty of the river valley and the ecosystem. If you have any concerns regarding wildlife feeding, please report those concerns to 311.
Garrett, for sharing that information with us. So we did have a couple of questions that citizens submitted before the webinar that I'm now going to share with you. So the first question is, recently we had a porcupine in our yard. Who should we contact within the city to find out how to deal with the porcupine?
So right now the city does not actually deal with porcupines in yards. I believe that was something that was managed by us in the past, but recently we've been deferring it to either private contractors or giving the citizens of Edmonton the tools and techniques on how to deal with it themselves. Porcupines aren't really a threat if you know how to deal with them. They mostly want to be left alone. That being said, if you want them to get out of your yard, one of the easiest ways to do it is set up some kind of live trap, like one of the Have a Heart traps that you can buy at PV Mart or most outdoor stores. And once the porcupine goes into the trap and gets caught, you could just take it out of your yard.
Another question for you, Garrett. I have seen people hanging bird feeders on trees in the parkland. Is this something you're allowed to do? Why or why not?
So hanging bird feeders on parkland is not allowed due to the fact that any kind of modification to parkland or any land that you don't own is considered an unauthorized use of parkland, which is prohibited under Section 4 of the Parkland bylaw. So any kind of modification, whether you're extending your backyard or setting up your own picnic tables in the ravine, it all falls under the category of unauthorized use of parkland. So we aren't necessarily going out looking for bird feeders, but we are totally authorized to remove bird feeders on parkland if we find them there.
Another question for you, Garrett. Can I feed birds on my property under the bylaw?
Yep, you're totally allowed to feed birds on your own property under the bylaw as long as it doesn't become a nuisance condition. So as we mentioned earlier in the webinar, a nuisance condition would be anything that leads to, say, property damage or a health risk. Any kind of nuisance condition would be defined under the community standards bylaw. So I actually have it here right now. So for the purpose of greater clarity of a nuisance, that would include excessive accumulation of accessible edible materials on the property. So if your bird feeder happens to have a giant pile of seed under it to the point where it could be considered excessive, anything where the food is raw and spoiled or moldy, anything that is leading to an increased presence of wildlife to the area generally, such as that guy that brought thousands of seagulls to that West Edmonton parking lot, anything that leads to property damage on neighboring properties or parkland due to the availability of food. So if you had a bird feeder that brought in so many birds that it actually became a problem for your neighbors and it was leading to property damage for your neighbors, then we would ask you to take down the bird feeder or modify the way you're feeding the birds.
And last question for you. What are the most common types of feeding complaints we deal with?
So in terms of the most common complaints we've been dealing with lately, we have had several where people are leaving out like piles of meat for coyotes on public green spaces. We've dealt with a few of those already this year, and now that the wildlife feeding bylaw is becoming more widely known, we are getting more nuisance complaints regarding bird feeding. So people that are leaving out excessive amounts of bird feed. So for anyone that just has their own private bird feeder in their backyard and they're worried this bylaw is going to target them, it won't. The nuisance conditions are designed to target people that are, you know, just dumping entire bags of bird seed in their backyard and leading to, you know, giant flocks of pigeons or seagulls taking up residence in a residential area and causing issues for the neighbors, whether it is by defecating all over their property or building nests in their roof, things like that. So that's more what the bylaw is designed to target, is people that are intentionally feeding coyotes or leading to any kind of nuisance conditions with birds.
Another question for you, Gareth. So I've heard that some types of bird feeders are better than others to make them less accessible to coyotes. Can you talk about some of those different bird seed containers or bird houses?
So this is an interesting one because there are different styles of bird feeder that are designed to attract different types of birds. So there are the typical tube style feeders, which are designed for smaller perching birds, such as sparrows, finches, chickadees, things like that. Then there are the larger tray style hopper feeders, which are meant more for blue jays, goldfinches, northern flickers, some larger birds. It also depends on what type of seed you're putting in there. In terms of accessibility to coyotes, as long as you hang them high enough off the ground, that shouldn't be an issue. You know, 7 or 8 feet up should be high enough that a coyote isn't able to reach it. That being said, the coyotes aren't typically going straight for the feeder itself. They're going for the piles of seed underneath the feeder, and they're going for the mice and voles that are going after the seed under the feeder. So the best way to avoid anything like that, I have seen at a couple different bird stores, they have kind of like a seed trampoline almost you can put under a hopper style feeder. I see Colleen shaking her head in approval, but there are some kind of like seed trampolines you can put under the hopper feeders, which will catch a lot of the seed that the birds throw over the side, and as well as just going out every once in a while and occasionally raking the area under the feeder to clean up any of the excessive accumulation of seed that the seed trampoline does not catch.
Hello everybody, my name is Carly Lynch and I'm the Education Manager at WildNorth. So thank you so much for joining us today for this Protecting Our Wildlife Neighbours webinar that we're all about at WildNorth. First, I'm going to give you just a bit of background about what we do, and then we'll get into answering some of your questions. So at WildNorth, we are a wildlife rescue and wildlife rehabilitation center. We are the northernmost full-scope wildlife rehabilitation center, so we have a full rescue team, and we can take care of every single species that you can basically get permission to take care of in Alberta. We take care of a lot of birds. About 80% of our patients are birds, and that's because we can take care of every single species of wild bird that can be found here in Alberta at any time of the year. Whether they live here all year round, like a great horned owl does, or maybe they migrate like a Canada goose, we can take care of them. So anything from a teeny tiny little hummingbird to a golden eagle and anything in between. For mammals, we have a few more rules that we have to follow. We cannot take care of every single species of mammal, and we cannot take care of every single age of mammal. So for example, something like a deer, we cannot take care of an adult deer, but we can take care of a deer fawn. Even though it's a bit more complicated than this, basically anything smaller than a coyote we can take care of. So things like beavers, porcupines, muskrats, jackrabbits, foxes, badgers, so all those smaller mammals we can usually take in. We do take care of reptiles and amphibians every once in a while, just not very often. We might get like one garter snake a year or maybe one tiger salamander, but it's mostly birds and smaller mammals. We do cover all of northern Alberta, basically anywhere from Red Deer north, and if you are anywhere outside of the city, we can still take care of wildlife. Our wildlife hospital is based in Edmonton. We are basically functioning out of the city, but we do have another rehabilitation center that's out in Parkland County, and we have some amazing volunteers that will drive all over Alberta and pick up animals, even in like Fort McMurray or something like that, and bring them down to us. So now let's just get into some of your questions that we're going to answer about protecting our wildlife neighbors and generally feeding wildlife as well. The first question is a nice kind of common question. If I see wildlife within the city that looks sick or injured, who should I call? So it's us. That's who you should call. If it's any bird species or small mammal species, again, we can take care of these creatures. First, though, we do suggest that you go onto our website to look for some advice. Our wildlife helpline is incredibly busy, especially in the spring and summertime when those are our busiest months. So far, we have answered more than 7,000 phone calls since May 1st. So we're very, very busy. And we have worked really hard to have a lot of advice on our website so that you can get the advice on what action to take without even needing to call us and leave a message and wait for us to call you back. That allows us to keep our phone lines open for lots of emergent situations and helps us just get back to people a lot more quickly. So you can call our helpline. Please do if you need to. If you have a complicated situation or if you can't find the advice you need on our website, we'd love for you to call and we'd love to talk you through whatever situation you found yourself in. We answer our phones and our messages on our phones every single day of the year. Right now in the summertime, we are answering messages between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. So you can give us a call and we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can. And if you call after our hours, we will call you back as soon as we open up again in the morning. So I just wanted to show you a quick picture of what our website looks like. We have this wildlife concern page at WILDNorth.ca, and you can go through it and basically find specific advice about the situation that you're in. So for example, you might find an animal that you think might be orphaned. So you can choose the baby/orphaned wildlife option, and it will go through like whether it's a songbird and how old the songbird is, and it'll tell you specific advice about that creature and the things that are natural for them and what you should do if you find one that you think might need help. So please have a look at our website. Again, it's wildnorth.ca, and if you still need assistance, please definitely call us. We are happy to help you. We answer well over 13,000 phone calls a year. The next question would be, who should I call after hours? So since we are a nonprofit, we do not have the ability or the resources to stay open 24 hours a day. Same thing like with checking our social media messages and stuff like that. We just cannot keep checking them 100% of the time. It's just not possible. So there are some after hours options. One, if you do need advice, of course, you can go to wildnorth.ca first, right, to find out if you can figure out what you can do about that situation. If you do have an animal that does need care after hours, please give a call to one of our 24-hour vet clinics in this area. So we have Guardian Veterinary Center on the south side of Edmonton, and we have Pulse veterinary specialists, and that's in Sherwood Park, and they might be able to provide care overnight. They're, of course, very busy as well, so please call them ahead of time, and hopefully they can take that animal in. Otherwise, if it is an animal that you are sure needs assistance, you're positive, even after doing all your research and stuff, you can hold on to it and bring it in to us as soon as we open up in the morning at 9 o'clock. We are open every single day of the year to help out wildlife. And right now, since it's our busy season, we're accepting intakes between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. The next question that we are going to answer is, what are some consequences of feeding wildlife? So this is something that we get asked about all the time. People are often calling our wildlife helpline about it. And even when we're like out doing rescues in parks, people are asking us. When I'm doing presentations in schools, I have a lot of children asking us this question because a lot of people want to help out wildlife, and a lot of people really want to have these interactions with them and to feed them. And if you have ever fed, like for example, in this picture, a duck or a goose bread, you know that they love it, right? You toss it in the water, they're going to come over to you right away, and it seems like you're doing a really nice thing for them. But in a lot of different situations, this can actually be kind of detrimental for wildlife. So for example, talking about these Canada geese again, feeding them can encourage more aggressive behavior. I don't know if you've ever been chased by a Canada goose in a park before, but we definitely don't want to encourage more aggressive behavior. They can be very protective of their families, so if you're going too close to their families, that might kind of edge them on. But if you're feeding them and all of a sudden there's no more food, or if they're expecting food from you and you don't have it, this could definitely be a problem. There's also issues with them getting too used to people. We have had animals come into our hospital that have just become too habituated to people, and that makes living life in the wild very, very difficult. So we want to make sure that you aren't feeding wildlife because they don't need it. They're choosing these habitats in these places because they can get everything that they need, and they don't need these kind of supplemental feedings from you. So even though it might seem like you're doing a really great thing for them, you might just actually be causing more harm than good. And we want to make sure that we're obviously not doing that. So you can hold on to your bread, and then you can just go and enjoy wildlife without actually having to feed them and interact with them in those ways. There are some more medical kind of related things that can happen when we are feeding wildlife. So these pictures that I'm going to show you have to do with feeding wildlife with bird feeders. So bird feeders are a really common way that people will feed wildlife in their communities, and that is fine, right? You can set up a bird feeder on your property, that's okay, but it is very, very important to always clean your bird feeders. A lot of people just don't even think about that, right? Before I started working at WILDNorth and before I started seeing some of these issues, I would have never considered having to wash a bird feeder if I were to have one. But there are some diseases that can be passed around, and some viruses and stuff like that can be passed around from bird to bird, especially at feeders where they're congregating and there's a bunch of them all the time. So these pictures are of a house finch, and this house finch basically got pink eye. It's a bird pink eye, so they get bacterial conjunctivitis. And this is a problem that we see all the time, especially in the winter when there's a lot of birds utilizing these bird feeders. And this can be passed from bird to bird at that feeder. So we want to make sure that you are washing your bird feeders basically as much as you possibly can. Ideally, like once a week would be great. You can use a diluted bleach solution to do this. If you can't do it once a week, at least like once every couple of weeks or something, just please do clean your bird feeders. And this can help save animals' lives. So this helps prevent the spread of diseases, and this can help prevent them from getting sick from like mold and stuff that can happen with these seeds. It's also really important to clean up the spilled bird seed underneath the feeders. If you have a bird feeder, you know that wildlife are not clean eaters. So you want to make sure to clean up that spilled seed because that can be an attractant to more types of wild animals, for example, rodents or even coyotes. So you want to make sure to clean that up as much as you can as well. If you do see a bird that looks like it's got conjunctivitis, definitely give us a call. We want them in at our wildlife hospital. And the next one that we'll talk about is just what types of animals do we see at WILDNorth that have come in because they're sick or injured because of feeding. So this is a picture of a young Canada goose that actually came in this year, and this Canada goose got angel wing. So angel wing is basically an issue that happens to these animals when they're not getting the proper nutrition, especially in places where they're eating a lot of bread. So there has been a lot of research about this, and there's no kind of like specific reason why they get angel wing, but usually it's because they're having too many carbs or too much protein, especially when they're growing. So it's the young birds that will develop angel wing. If they're eating a lot of bread or the food that's not good for them, while they're growing up, their bones can basically grow at the wrong angle. And this is not something that can be fixed once it develops, and these birds will never be able to fly again. So you can see that this goose's feathers are damaged, they're kind of turned out at the wrong angle. This can be really, really harmful for them, and it's not something that can be fixed. So we really want to make sure that you are not feeding ducks and geese bread, even though they really, really seem to like it, right? And you may have kind of witnessed that, and they might approach you and be asking for it, but please don't do that because it can be really detrimental to them. And we see a few of these cases every year of this angel wing, and it's just really, really sad because it's not something that can be fixed, and it was something that is preventable. So please hold on to that bread again. I'm going to say that many times in these types of presentations because it's really not good for them. It's also not a natural food source for these animals either, right? So they could get other nutritional deficiencies. We do sometimes see this thing called metabolic bone disease in wildlife, and that's because the parents have been feeding these babies food that is not nutritious for them. So if they're getting like food from fast food places, if people are feeding these crows or something, a lot of French fries or something like that, that they will pass that on to their babies, and the babies aren't going to be able to develop properly, and that can be a big issue as well. So when it comes to feeding wildlife, even though you might think that it is helpful and that it's a really nice thing to do for them, I mean, I really appreciate you wanting to help out wildlife, but basically just keep it to yourself. Bird feeders are okay, but just make sure that you wash them as much as you possibly can. And this can help save wild lives. And if you're watching this presentation, I feel like you might want to do that. And again, if you ever find a wild animal that you are concerned about, you think it might be hurt or sick or orphaned or something, definitely give us a call at WILDNorth and see our website at wildnorth.ca. Our helpline phone number is 780-914-4118, and we answer our phones again every single day of the year. You'll probably have to leave a message at this point because we're on the phone 100% of the time because we're so busy, but please do so, and we want to talk to you about these situations, and we want to help out as much as we can. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you learned a little bit today.